So I read a little bit on my own in the paper version, so I will also try to catch up in the electronic version also. So let's continue the battle for China, essays on the military history of the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945. So last time we left off, we are on the eve of war. So we are going to examine the readiness, the disposition of both armies, both the Japanese and Chinese armies, and try to analyze the strategic thinking and the organization on both sides. It is a commonplace belief that the Japanese and Chinese armies were mismatched. Japan possessed a modern industrial base, a strong military institution, and popular support for its army. China had none of those advantages. Nevertheless, Chinese forces under Chiang Kai-shek managed to force the Japanese army into a protracted war of attrition. The reasons for this seeming paradox may be found in Chang. This seems to be a non-opinion. I'm not sure. And Edward J. Dredd Perspective Essays on the State of Japanese and Nationalist Armies in 1937. So he seems to be an author of a later essay in this collection. In chapter 3, he demonstrates that, or she demonstrates that influential Chinese military thinkers have been considering the notion of protracted war since the 1920s. So they know they can't win immediately, which is why they need to draw it out and exhaust the Japanese resources. Under German tutelage from the 1920s and the mid-1930s, the Kuomintang army slowly but steadily prepared to defend China against what leaders regarded as a certain aggression from Japan. So for some historical context, there was a Chinese-German cooperation that went on in the 1920s into the mid-1930s. This mainly involved China giving Germany raw resources, I think such as tungsten, in exchange for German military equipment and German advisory. This is important for Germany because Germany needed those raw resources and couldn't get them much on the European market because the situation past Treaty of Versailles forbid Germany from many things. So they could get these resources from China, and China needed the German military experience and advisory. So if you will look at, let's say, the German equipped, so there were some German equipped Chinese divisions. If you look at their helmets, they're wearing the Stahlhelm, which is the German helmet. So you'll see this sort of German World War II-esque helmet, which is basically the Nazi helmet on Chinese soldiers. And these German-trained, German-equipped Chinese divisions had German equipment for the most part. Although it is mostly light equipment, it's not heavy equipment. This defensive orientation gave rise to a Fabian strategy, strong positional defenses, especially around Shanghai. So essentially, fortify the big cities, dig in, and try to fight an attrition warfare. And an attempt to build an army sadly lacking in popular support and money. This is partly due to the decentralization of the government, the rise of warlords, also the lack of political authority from Chiang Kai-shek himself. He's really a military guy. Non-standardization of weaponry plagued the Kuomintang army as did shortages of artillery weapons and transport. So logistically, they're bad. They don't have the heavy artillery pieces, the heavy equipment like tanks or planes or heavy artillery. Logistics were weak and bedeviled the army throughout its existence. This is not only because the army lacks such resources, the entire nation lacks such resources, right? Chinese railroads are very, very behind compared to the Japanese ones. And Chinese car manufacturing I don't think is even existent back then. So when the civilian basis for such logistics don't exist, military logistics will suffer inevitably. Because when you see during wartime, um, industrial nations like the United States can convert their car manufacturing plants into tank manufacturing plants, and they can acquisition certain civilian industries for military use. But when you don't have any civilian industry, you can't do that. So, infrastructure wise, industry wise, China is very behind. More significant, perhaps, was a lack of coordination between regional forces and the national army, between Chiang Kai shek and his lieutenants, and between politicians and intellectuals and the military. So, politicians and intellectuals have disagreements because a lot of intellectuals are left wing. The government is relatively right wing after the communist purge, and the military is also not in alignment with the politicians, because politicians is mostly led by Wang Jingwei, and the military is led by Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek. Intellectuals are their own, and they have a powerful press there to monitor the government. Chang discusses at length the Army's training system, noting its shortfalls in recruiting, its unevenness because of regional strengths or weaknesses, and its inability to produce sufficiently trained staff officers. Jiang was in the process of reforming and rebuilding a woefully unprepared Kuomintang army, but in July 1937, time ran out. In Edward Drea's account in Chapter 4, the Japanese army is a mirror image of its Chinese counterpart. Drea concentrates on more strategic and operational planning, tactics, and doctrinal development. He presents a picture of a highly trained, toughly disciplined, confident military organization that was well equipped by 1937 standards. Japan's military leaders sought in terms of rapidly moving offensive operations designed to force decisive battles and gain quick victories in short-term wars. So pause here to note, 1937 standards is not very high. Why is that? It's because before 1937, no major wars has really occurred since 1918. Of course, there were some European wars, such as the Polish-Soviet War, or the various struggles between the nascent nation states that were formed in the Versailles Treaty, and also the Wilsonian aspect of that. So there were some wars between basically every Eastern European nation that recently formed, but nothing major, right? The only thing that is about to happen is the Sino-Japanese War. So a lot of the new doctrines, such as mobile warfare, or for example, concentration of tanks, or the usage, extensive usage of the Air Force, or carrier dominant Navy instead of a battleship dominant Navy. These things are still beginning to be developed. So, by those standards, we are saying that Japan is quite ahead. So, it's quite ahead compared to most other nations of the world who are also suffering from the Great Depression. Japan's military leaders, so they think it's not necessary to develop an army for long attrition warfare because they can just win quickly against China. So this is the way they equipped and trained everything. Following the Manchurian incident of 1931, the army devoted its attention more to the resurgent Soviet Union than to China. Just as Chinese military leaders regarded war with Japan as inevitable, Japanese generals presumed the same about a war with the Soviet Union. So they believe they are ideological enemies that must confront each other in war at some point. Thus, the Japanese army crafted a doctrine, operational plan, and force structure to fight the Soviets. Planners assumed contingency operations against China should they occur because of local friction, and assumed the regional conflict was a brief and decisive result for Japan. By 1937, the army was in the midst of a process of reorganization and modernization expected to complete in the early 1940s. So you see, during some reorganization, the army is vulnerable because when you're switching in the new equipment and removing the old. You're searching in the new organizational structures and removing the old. You don't know the flaws of the new organizational structures or the new weapons yet. The enemies will exploit those for you, which is definitely not good. So it seems like they are not really hoping to fight a war from 1937 into the early 1940s. They're trying to, by that time, organize and strike at the Soviet Union by the end of that organization, seems to be their goal. So they're woefully not prepared for fighting China um, in terms of like military doctrine, organization, and so on. Until then, the army wished to avoid a major war on the Asian continent, but for Japanese army too, time ran out. So both sides are underprepared, Chinese a lot more so. So let us begin. So chapter 3 will be about Chinese organization, chapter 4 about Japanese organization. 3, the nationalist army on the eve of war. Actually, I don't know how do you pronounce this because it's not the standard pinyin layout. 长认德. This is not how I would think to pronounce this. Yeah. When I saw those English letters. Introduction. Noon, July 7th, 1937. Xu Yongchang, director of the Nationalist Government of Military, the Nationalist Government's Military Affairs Commission, said to a friend, "Young people from rich families and students are not willing to become soldiers nowadays. Only the poor join up. In fact, once their living conditions improve, the poor also don't want to serve. If we implement a conscription system, people will join against their will and lack ardor. This being so, to defeat Japanese aggression, we must reform the education system to change people's attitudes about our country, or we will perish." So, this is an interesting idea because the Republic, the Chinese Republic, Chinese nation as a state, is also a new idea. It is not always, has not always been there. This is analogous to when the, for example, let's say the revolution of 1848 in Germany, you have a rise of nationalism. What it means to be German. What does Germany mean instead of hundreds of city-states in the Holy Roman Empire? What does it mean? Similar situations going on in China at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century. People are starting to have this idea of a nation state. So this process is still ongoing clearly and not solidified. Chiang Kai-shek then sent a letter today that discussed educational reform in detail. But that night, the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred. So it's a little bit too late for that, but because the Marco Polo Bridge incident is the incident that sparks the Second Sino-Japanese War. Essentially, what some people might consider to be the beginning of World War II. Some people think it's a regional conflict, but anyways, the war is about to begin. On August 2nd, 1937, Jiang sent a telegram to provincial, military, and civil officials because the war has begun on July 7th, declaring the government was committed to fight the Japanese. The telegram invited officials to Nanjing to discuss strategy because they are already fighting. The Japanese and Chinese are already fighting on a wide front. Bai Chongxi, the number 2 man of the Guangxi clique, and a widely admired strategy. So before we get into this, let's first examine where is the Guangxi clique. So they're in the southwest corner of China, and they have their own military and their own organization and all that. Oh, this actually doesn't give me a map. I guess I'll go for a map. That's better. A Hearts of Iron 4 map. Okay, I guess, yeah, this one's better. So you see in the southwest corner of China, tucked away from potential Japanese invasions, because the Japanese are invading from the north and eventually from Shanghai from the east. so they are relatively safe for now. So they don't have to quite involve themselves in this conflict just yet, but we'll see what happens. And a widely admired strategist discussed the telegram with senior Guangxi officials as well as Li Zongren, the clique's leader. The consensus was that Li and Bai should decline the invitation, as a rival Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek might imprison them. So this is what they are thinking, right? Their nation is at war with a foreign power much, much more powerful than them, and they're still thinking, well, if I go to this meeting, I might get arrested because I'm a regional power. No one trusts each other. Jiang Jieshi and Li Zongren had competed for national leadership ever since the Northern Expedition of 1926 to 1928. So I don't know much about Northern Expedition, but I know it started from Guangzhou or Guangxi, where obviously Li Zongren has his base of power, and Chiang Kai-shek gained his military power in those northern expeditions. So in the very beginning, they knew each other very well. Didn't quite get along apparently. Bai, on the other hand, held that Guangdong and Guangxi had consistently advocated resisting Japan and that the Chinese people supported that policy. He also believed that if he did not go to Nanjing, not only would he be casting doubt on Jiang's sincerity, he would also fail to live up to his own public promises, for which the Chinese people would condemn him. He's also looking at the public opinion aspect of it. Bai won the argument and convinced Li Zongren to promise Jiang the Guangxi clique's support for war. Bai immediately departed while Li Zongren stayed in Guilin to organize the mobilization of the province, ready to follow Bai if necessary. So one of them went and the other one stayed home in case something stupid happens. The other one can immediately strike. The exchange of telegrams between Guangxi and the nationalist government was brought to the attention of Liu Xiang. I'm not sure the exact pronunciation. Let me check. So he is a Sichuan guy. Because this guy's also a the pinyin is also a very famous sprinter in China, so that's why I hesitate. Is Liu Xiang. Yep. So Sichuan will become important later on in this war because it is a province which will host the new Chinese capital when the nationalists begin their retreat. So as you can see, it is quite tucked into the interior of China, far away from any seacoast or any north or east direction. So it's quite mountainous terrain, easy to hide in, and very easy to set up a wartime capital. So he went, this guy from in charge of Sichuan went to the national conference, and also Yunlong, provincial chairman of Yunnan. Yunnan, again, also even more tucked away than Sichuan arguably is this province right here. So Liu and Long noted although they had too heard that the nationalist government was prepared to send its armies into the field to fight Japan, doubts remained about its real commitments. Because remember, in many instances in 1933 and 35, the nationalist government both backed down and removed their troops from the frontier areas and settled for agreements with the Japanese army. So it's unclear if the nationalists will actually fight the Japanese, or if it's a ploy to fake fight the Japanese and capture all the regional leaders. They warned that in case Jiang did not go to war and Bai and Li lost their freedom, the nationalist government would be able to establish control over Guangxi province. So you see, from Guangxi province, they can easily infiltrate Yunnan and Sichuan, after which they would be next, because they're neighboring provinces. In his answer, Li Zongren urged Liu and Long to support the nationalist government and mobilize their provinces as well, stating that otherwise their inactivity would constitute a concession to the Japanese invaders. So Li Zongren is evaluating this as a real war that's about to begin, and you better get started, or else China will be losing precious mobilization time. On the evening of 7th August 1937, Jiang summoned the Supreme Defense Council and the Central Committee of the Nationalist Party to discuss military strategy. So, of course, the Central Committee of the Nationalist Party is a political thing, and the Supreme Defense Council is a military thing. That's how I look at it, anyways. I'm an expert, of course. In attendance were provincial level military and civil officers in Nanjing, as well as regional military leaders such as Yan Xishan, Bai Chongxi, Yu Hanmou, He Jian, and Liu Xiang. Some of these pronunciations might be entirely wrong because I don't know the exact opinion of them. The discussion ended with Jiang declaring that when faced with war, we must resolve to be determined and implement our decision unreservedly, for our survival depends upon it. We must stick to our plan. Well, this is basically saying you guys better not run with your armies, because if any one of us flees from the field, it's over. We are already at a huge disadvantage against Japan as it is. And this is really a national moment because these guys are all coming together. We must entrust the national government to make the necessary preparations for war, as it is left to it to decide to proceed or retreat. Local governments must obey and follow the national government without hesitation. All participants stood up to signify their unanimous agreement. Railroad Minister Zhang Jiao. Actually, let me search this up. This guy might be important because railroads is extremely important in modern warfare. At least in World War II it was. Oh, it's Zhang Gongquan. That's very strange. Okay, I also do not know how to read traditional Chinese, but I can guess at it. Who attended the meeting stated, "The conference united the entire nation, unseen for centuries." It is rumored that Yan Xishan and Liu Xiang attended the conference because of Bai Chongxi's decision to travel to Nanjing. Yeah, this guy, he sort of had a feeling that something was wrong and the war was real, so everyone needed to head over there. However, upon his return to Sichuan, when Liu discussed with his aides the dispatch of Sichuan forces to the front, one suggested he need not personally lead them as he suffered from a gastric ulcer, so he doesn't need to head to the dangerous areas and be stuck in between nationalist central and armies where he could be captured or in danger. Liu responded that, "In the past I have fought bitter civil wars, but now we have the opportunity to join in the war against Japan. We must do our best for the nation so that history may record our positive contributions to its welfare." Okay, it's an interesting statement. China began the Sino-Japanese War against this background of internal division. So there is internal division, but it seems like people are slowly starting to realize the danger of the situation and unite together in some coherent way. This chapter discusses the development of the nationalist armies during the years before the beginning of war. I discuss military strategy and tactics, equipment and logistics, the construction of national defense projects and bases in China's hinterland, military education and training, the staff system of the army, the military hierarchy, and reorganization of armies and divisions, as well as their combat effectiveness. This chapter excludes the Navy and the Air Force, which remain seriously underdeveloped. Yeah, I think the Air Force is a lot better off than the Navy. They have some old, probably I-16s from the Soviet Air Force, and various assortment of other planes, British, maybe French planes. This chapter suggests despite real progress in many areas, the Nationalist Army was no match for Japan in 1937, largely because its rapid modernization was thwarted by these domestic, political, and military divisions. Okay, so let's begin. Strategy, national defense planning, and tactics. So this is more of the idea sphere of things. This is not the material sphere. We're talking about organization, things in the head and on paper. Beginning in the decade 1910 to 1920, some Chinese intellectuals began to consider a full-scale conflict between Japan and China as inevitable. In the ensuing discussions about China's strategic options, Jiang Fangzhen, or also known as Jiang Baili, I don't actually know who this guy is. Again, I'm quite ignorant when it comes to these matters. Um, yeah, okay, it actually is pronounced Jiang Baili. So, was the first to advocate protracted warfare as China's military strategy, thus anticipating China's approach to the Sino-Japanese War. In his youth, Jiang had studied in Japan and developed a deep understanding of Japan's government and military. A lot of the earlier military officers in the Chinese army were studied in. They had went to school in Japan and studied in military school academies in Japan. So that's sort of somewhat of an advantage because they know how the Japanese army is organized. As early in 1917, as early as 1917, Jiang predicted that China and Japan would become involved in a drawn-out war, and that the combat zone would be west of the Peking-Wuhan and Guangzhou-Wuhan railways. So let's take a look, right? Because we can't just. When I read these books, I always get confused because I think, well, where are these places you were talking about? It doesn't really make sense, right? So I think it is much better to have a map. Oh, I mean, this seems like a sufficient map. Oh, okay. Let me just zoom in here. So, first you have the Peking-Wuhan Railroad, which is this one, and then you have Guangzhou-Wuhan. So that's from here to Guangzhou, also known as Canton. So this railroad all the way down here. And this author essentially predicted the Sino-Japanese War would occur in this area east of such a railroad, which is an interesting prediction because I think the Japanese First Army essentially went along this railroad, and the Japanese Second Army went along that one, like I said last time, and then some minor Japanese units went west. So also the Central Japanese army went to Shanghai, so they also went up the Yangtze River. So this later in Guofang Lun, Jiang again argued that China should use protracted warfare to frustrate Japan's desire for a quick victory. He argued that China should exploit its huge population and vast territory to prolong the war so as to erode Japan's strength over time and gradually turn the situation in China's favor. So this kind of grand strategy is very fixed. As long as the geopolitical situation remains similar, you can make similar strategies. It's not like a gun which becomes outdated in 10 or 20 years. He continued to argue that China should not defend coastal areas but confront the enemy west of the Peking-Wuhan Railway. Oh, that's really smart because Japan has naval supremacy, and there's no reason to bother with the navy. Jiang Jieshi came to agree the longer the war drags on, the more advantageous for China. Despite much popular criticism, both the nationalist government and General Zhang Xueliang, the ruler of Manchuria, had decided not to resist Japan by force when it attacked Manchuria in September 1931 and Shanghai in 1932. So in both times they retreated. One thing to note is Manchuria is the sphere of Zhang Xueliang and Shanghai is the sphere of Jiang. So they both personally gave up a little bit. Also, Zhang Xueliang obviously much worse because he lost all of Manchuria. Jiang Jieshi was especially reluctant to confront Japan as he still faced a communist insurgency in his heartland and because he believed that Chinese troops would suffer a rapid defeat. He predicted that within 3 days, Japan would seize the key areas along the Chinese coast. I mean, this is insane. 3 days. Look at how big this coastline is. He's saying that in 3 days all this will be seized. That's very, in my view, like highly estimating the Japanese army. Just the sheer transportation abilities of the Japanese army. But the point is clear. Like he thinks the Chinese army does not stand a chance, and cripple China in destroying its military, transport, and financial lifelines. So this is in 1931 or 32. He thinks that. After the North China incident in May 1935, Japan became increasingly aggressive in North China, and Jiang gradually toughened his stance. So one, it might be because the demands are increasingly intolerable, and two, the Chinese army is getting stronger by the day. The nationalist government proposed a twin strategy of seeking peace and security but also preparing for war. If peace became impossible, China would mobilize its national resources to seek ultimate victory in prolonged war. China formally adopted protracted warfare as its basic strategy in its national defense plan. After the Sino-Japanese clash at Shanghai of 28 January 1932, I think about 2 Japanese divisions were involved in this, and two Chinese armies. To prevent the conflict of Shanghai from escalating further, well, not the entire armies, probably the elements from those two armies, the Military Affairs Commission drew up a plan which divided China into 4 defense areas and 1 preparation area. Okay, I wonder if we can see this. Maybe there won't be a plan for this because it's. Oh, there won't be a map for this because this is the plan in 1932. Military Affairs Commission Defense Plan. No, these are all modern. Yeah, that's no good. So, while some troops were to maintain local security, commanders of those areas were to concentrate their remaining forces to prepare for a confrontation with Japan. Because this is not a national army, each warlord still has their own region, so you have to take those regions into account when planning for war. This was the earliest national defense plan, primarily aimed to defeat Japanese aggression. Several other national defense plans were drawn up subsequently. Although detailed, they were not implemented until 1935. I think I'll pause here for today. Thanks for listening.